video, we are going to talk about climate change. We're going to talk about it in a very simple and brief way so that we understand what is it, why it's happening, and what sort of impact do we expect from that change. The whole story when we talk about climate change, it's about greenhouse effects. When we talk about greenhouses, they are actually built to allow solar radiation into the house and keeping most of it and letting out just a small proportion of that energy so that uh, the house would be warmer inside compared to the outside environment and also would be more appropriate for growing certain crops. That's greenhouse effect. So when we talk about global warming, it's more or less the same story. We're talking about slow increase in the average temperature of the atmosphere and the Earth surface, and that's because of increased amount of energy striking the Earth from the sun and being trapped in the atmosphere and not radiated out into space. So why is this happening? Well, actually, it's a natural process that at the top layer of the atmosphere, there are concentration of certain gases that's allowing solar radiation into the atmosphere, reflecting some of it out, and also trapping a proportion of that energy into the atmosphere. That's naturally happening, and that's why we don't see much difference between day temperature and night temperature compared to other planets in the galaxy. We are talking about greenhouse gases, we're talking about ozone, we're talking about clouds and aerosols. So when we talk about climate change, we are talking about a long-term change. We're talking about significant change. And it's not like the fluctuation that we see in the weather. We're talking about, as I said, about a trend, increasing trend. So when we talk about climate system, what do we mean by climate system? Actually, climate system consists of 5 components. They are highly interactive with each other, and whenever a change happens in one of the components, that affects the remaining components. We're talking about the first component is the hydrosphere. We're talking about the water bodies. We're talking about oceans, lakes, rivers. We're talking about the biosphere in terms of ecosystem with its different uh, factors and elements. We're talking about the atmosphere, the air. We're talking about the geosphere, the land. And we're talking about cryosphere, which is the ice caps. We're talking about seasonal snow. We're talking about mountain glaciers, that sort of thing. So as I said, if one of the components is changing, that will change the remaining components of the system. When we talk about greenhouse greenhouse gases, what do we mean actually by greenhouse gases? We have uh, 6 components. The first is water vapor, which is um, water in gaseous form, which blocks the heat from escaping from the atmosphere, but also it can have a cooling effect because if we're talking about the clouds, they will reflect some of the solar radiation out into space again and not allowing it to reach the Earth at the Earth's surface. The most important 3 greenhouse gases, we're talking about carbon dioxide, which is coming from burning fossil fuels, which is the most important greenhouse gas. We're talking about methane, which comes from wetlands, growing rice, and raising cattle, as well as in mining, natural gas, and coal. The next one is nitrous oxide, which comes from some types of factories, power plants, fertilizers firms or factories. It has two effects. It damages the ozone layer, and it is one of the most powerful greenhouse gases. In addition, we have the ozone and chlorofluorocarbons. But the issue with this is that, especially CO2, it remains in the atmosphere for a very long time, which is opposite of the case of water vapor. It's uh, it's in the atmosphere for short periods of time. So the effects of the three that we're talking about here, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, is much higher than the remaining greenhouse gases. So what about these three gases? These are the concentration of these gases into the atmosphere. We can see that the concentration of CO2 uh, part per million over the years is increasing. There's a trend of increase. The same applies with different magnitude with the methane and also with the nitrous oxide. So they are increasing. As I said, when they are increasing, their concentration is increasing. It means that the function they are playing in terms of greenhouse effect is increasing. Okay, what is the main determinants of emission of such gases? Well, the first one is population growth. With the population increase, there are consumption, production activities, human activities. All of these are affecting the emissions of these gases. We also have the socioeconomic development. We're talking about economic growth. Economic growth means that we are increasing production, either in existing activities or new additional activities, which means that the emissions will be increasing. Land use changes, especially when we talk about deforestation. Forests play a role in dealing with the CO2, especially. So when we do deforestation, it means that we have less mitigation to deal with the emissions of greenhouse gases. Also, we have two factors. Is the first one is efficiency of technology in terms of use of energy. If we have more efficient technology, it means that the energy we use relative to production is low, which means that less emissions. When we talk about uh, renewable and non-renewable energy sources, we're talking about renewable being able to produce the energy that we need without a large proportion of the emissions that we get when we talk about fossil fuels. These are the factors that are determinants of the greenhouse gases. As long as they are leading to increased emission, it means that we are going to get more effect or greenhouse effect. Okay, let's just have a look at a couple of observations to convey what we mean by what are we talking about. We're talking here about temperature between 1880 and 2014. Temperature has been going up and down, and then we see that from 2000 the process is going up all the time with a high magnitude or high rate, which means that the earth land ocean temperature is increasing. That increase, according to scientists, accounted for between 1880, which is the year when they started to record temperature regularly, and 2014 by about 0.7 degree Celsius. Okay, another thing that we need to think about is the warmest years, years between 1880 and 2018. Between 1880 and 2018, actually, we have 9 of the 10 warmest years coming from between 2005 and 2018. The only one outside of that is in 1998. So we're talking about a trend, as we just said, that there's an annual increase in temperature. Maybe it's not uh, large, it's slow, but over time it accumulates, and that's the problem we're talking about. Along with the change in temperature, we have change between 1961 and 1990 and 2019. We have changes in precipitation patterns. Certain areas are having less precipitation, other areas are having higher precipitation. The issue also is flash flood, which means that we're getting, even if we get the same amount of precipitation, but we get it in a very short time compared to what used to happen before. We also have sea level rise. Actually, higher temperature means ice will be melting in different places, adding more water into the oceans and rivers and seas. And also, with the increasing temperature, some of this temperature is being absorbed by the waters, which means there is thermal expansion in the water. With these two factors, that leads to rising sea levels, which affects the whole system of the oceans and seas, and also can affect coastal areas along these seas and oceans. Okay, so what are we talking about? We're talking about climate change, we're talking about increasing temperature, precipitation changing, we're talking about sea level rise, we're talking about extremes, like what I just said about flash flooding. And this leads to effects on different sectors. We're talking about health effects, we're talking about effects or impacts on agriculture, we're talking about impacts on forests, we're talking about impacts on resources in terms of precipitation, availability of water, and quality of water. We're talking about coastal areas, changes in the dynamics of the oceans and the seas, and also impact on the wildlife that most probably will be adversely affected by climate change. So the point is, let's just think for a moment. Uh, the question is, do you think that any sector uh, cannot be affected by climate change? Well, actually, give it a try, and you'll find out that all sectors will be affected by climate change. Maybe in different magnitudes, but actually they will be affected. Which means it's not gonna be some sort of environmental impact on certain sectors. Actually, it's gonna affect the whole process of development itself. I hope that we were able to give you some glimpse about climate change, what is causing climate change, and what are the main impacts of climate change. And I hope that you enjoyed this video. Thank you.